Here comes the nasty gram.
Send a priest to save my soul, forget it.
Well, hello, Nasty Gram listeners, and welcome to a very special bonus holiday episode of our Game Master Roundtable. This is Josh, and for this one, I am joined by...
Hey, this is Jake.
This is Devin.
And Dan.
And I'm Kevin.
All right, and you guys will recognize a few of those names with a couple new ones. So I want to introduce you guys to some special guests. First off is Kevin from Game Night Heroes. I know we've mentioned his podcast before.
Hello.
Kevin is a friend of the show, fellow gamer, nerd, and podcaster. And Kevin, you want to say hello, talk a little bit about your podcast, and give a quick background on how you got into role-playing games and running games.
Oh, yeah, I would love to. Yeah, definitely. I love the show. Nastygram is good, fun stuff. And I'm Kevin, Kevin Stacy. I am the host and the game master of the Game Night Heroes podcast. It's an actual play podcast that tells stories, just like Nastygram does. I have a rotating cast. I'm kind of the only core member that's been doing it the whole time, but don't hold that against me. I'm glad to be here. This is going to be a lot of fun. I first got into gaming actually when I was in high school, mid-90s, second edition D&D, the usual, and played with some friends and her family, basically, and got out of it, girls, cars, life, you lose that stuff. But, came back after college, and I've been kind of a forever GM for about 20 years now. I love it. It's not just a hobby, it's a way of life, I'm sure you guys can relate. But no, I love it. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to share some insight and to have a good conversation.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Happy to have you as our first actual other podcast guest.
For sure.
And the other new voice on the mic is Devin. Devin is a friend of ours and has been talking to me about his feedback on Nastygram. And basically, the cheat is, if you ever want to be on the show, just keep coming up to us and telling us how good it is. That's it. So Devin is a gamer. We'd actually never role-played together before.
Never.
And so we started playing a game recently on mics, nothing released yet, might be bonus material or something down the road, but Devin's been running a Delta Green game that has been fucking awesome. And he is going to be on the main feed coming up shortly in the next couple months. So this is a good chance to get you guys to hear him. So Devin, tell us about your gamer background.
Hey, I'm Devin. I am a gamer, nerd, summarily. I started, I was in college, home from winter break, summer break, played D&D 4th edition with a couple of friends. I said, this is fucking awesome. I want to do more of it. And so I got in with some crowds in college. We played some games. We actually play tested the 5th edition of D&D, played a little bit of Pathfinder 1st edition. And then once I left school, that was something, I didn't get my degree. I was on the 5-year plan, never finished.
Overrated.
But the thing that I did bring back from school is games, tabletop games.
Nice.
Sounds like sounds like a win right there.
The value that I got out from putting in is, that's another story.
You started with 4th edition.
I did.
Yeah, that's a horror story.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
And you're still here, so.
And I'm still here.
Yeah.
I liked the online, the character building thing. I don't think I would have gotten into it if I didn't have those tools that 4th edition had, where you just click through your abilities and then you have them all on a character sheet. It was learning how to flip through a book and pick things out was an acquired skill. But since then, I have been exploring other role-playing games. D&D I found is really easy and beginner-friendly, so that's sort of the one I play most with my friends. But I've actually been talking with Josh for a while about some different games. The 2D6 games that you guys have played, Dungeon World, World of Darkness, Fate, in addition to some D20 things, Pathfinder 2nd edition, D&D, stuff like that. So I like to play different games. I like to I have a sort of a GM's mind where I like to take things that I see from other games and incorporate them into different systems, just to tell a better story. I think there's a lot out there, and I think for GMs, if you can synthesize some of those things, you can enhance the experience of one particular system or fit your table, whatever you need.
Nice. Yeah, I think this will be good. We've done a few of these little Game Master roundtables. We've released one, and one thing that we had talked about would be really cool is most of us, the guys you hear on Nastygram, have been gaming together for a super long time, and there's upside to that. Like hopefully you build good table chemistry and things like that. But we're kind of like the music guys in High Fidelity, where like we just like to sniff our own farts and talk about how like the way we do things is the right way. It'll be fun to have a discussion with people that don't have the exact same influence as us.
Josh, with that in mind, I don't know if you had an idea of where you wanted to start this, but
we haven't even said the topic.
Oh, we haven't.
We haven't.
Okay.
Wow. Well,
I thought we were just going to talk about how awesome our shows were. That's not what we're doing.
if you're like watching this, but you're not looking at like the title.
Right.
Oh yeah, horror. So this is dropping on Halloween, and we are here to talk about horror and role playing games. But with that, Jake, when you
well, I was going to say, you mentioned that we, you and Dan and I have kind of played role playing games together for 20-something years at this point. So we kind of like know each other pretty well, and we know what to expect. And one thing that I had never happened to me before until playing Devin's game, I'd never played a game, and I don't know the terminology, but where before the game you were like, here are like the themes that we're going to be exploring. And I know like through like reading online that that's a common thing when you're playing with people who you've never played with before or new groups. And Kevin, I don't think I've heard you do that on any of yours.
Yeah, we do session zeros, but we don't actually usually put them out, but we do them. Yeah, it's really important to get that that common ground with your players for sure.
That sort of what is that called, Devin? There's a name for it.
I don't know.
It's essentially.
I call them trigger warnings.
Essentially,
trigger warnings. Especially when we're talking about this theme before. Is trigger warnings of, hey, these are some, especially in games. We're all adults, but there are some themes that some people might be less comfortable with than others. So just laying out the sort of themes and topics that will be discussed. I don't know if there's a name for that.
We always call those session zero. I'm not sure if that's the official term, but that's what I've always seen them kind of labeled as online, I guess you could say.
Well, we usually do a session zero, but we don't really talk about we don't really do the whole warning of what the content is going to be.
I think that's because we take for granted knowing each other.
Exactly, because we don't need to, because we kind of know, and if there are subjects that we don't feel comfortable with, we know each other well enough to already know that. I know it's a common thing. I'm spoiler, gonna run a vampire game eventually, and I've been reading a lot about Vampire the Masquerade, and I know that's a very common thing in Vampire the Masquerade. They actually have a sheet you can print out and give to your players and check off things that you're not comfortable role playing. And I mean, we wouldn't have to do that at our table, but it does seem worth mentioning in a horror podcast,
Yeah.
I would just know that if I were running a game for Josh, I would not include robots.
No robots.
No robots.
Well, if it's horror.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, that's actually a good one, Jake, and maybe to throw it to definitely Kevin and maybe Devin. I don't know how much you play with people you don't always know great, but specifically with that kind of trigger warning danger stuff, how have you handled that? How do you kind of bring that up in your session zeros?
Yeah, definitely. Something that I've seen that gets a lot of play online, I use it with my groups. I've seen other people use it too, is Monte Cook Games actually has a gaming consent form, which basically it details all the different things different subjects, like you could have how much violence is going to be in the game, how much certain types of content. You can have basically green, which is it's full, good to go. You have yellow, which has to be veiled. You can maybe reference it, but it's not detailed. And then you have red, which is like a hard stop. We don't go here. It's basically detailing your safety tools that you have in the game, but on a paper, like a checklist. And that's what we use, because my games are all basically like rotating. I don't have a steady set cast. I have some people that I play with a lot, but it's good to get when you have new people to get everybody on the same page with that. That's what we use.
Yeah, there's another idea called an X card, where everyone has a flashcard with an X drawn on it. And as the GM in a session 0 would be going through talking about some of the themes and topics.
And he unbuckles his belt.
And then he looks around. If no one holds up the X card, he continues. But you have this really easy thing where there's no explanation needed. All you got to do is hold up that X card, say, hey, this is something I'm not comfortable with. And then that's it. I think that's why I think session 0s are important, because you then, if you nip that stuff in the bud, the GM doesn't have to do work to involve that thing in the game and then have to remove it. So in a sort of a session 0, just talking about, hey, violence against children is something I'm uncomfortable with, X card. And then it gives the GM time and enough, just to say, hey, this is something we're not interested in exploring. We're going to cut this out.
Yeah.
It's also a litmus test to like just kind of do a morality meter on everyone at the table.
Yeah.
Be like, oh, you're evil.
Give me more of that. Give me more.
Yeah, I love violence against children. I'm all for it.
I think the other thing that's
Extra? Is there an extra box?
Yeah. I have to imagine in the world of modern, like, DM as a job, like, it's just
that's
so
got to
much
be an
more.
important tool for you.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
I think another great important thing in the horror genre with the session 0 is talking about sort of the atmosphere of the game you're going for. And, we've been talking about the next arc you're running, Josh, and, you told us, like, I don't want wizards and fucking demons and stuff like that. I think it's important to be on the same page with your players as far as what kind of atmosphere you're going for, like, so that you don't have a bunch of players that show up with, like, everyone's playing the silly bard who's going to, like, throw pies at the enemy, like that can really ruin the atmosphere when your players are not on board with your horror theme.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah. So setting the feel of a game, there's different types of horror, right? There's the kind of genre types, like the cosmic horror, like that Cthulhu, Lovecraft kind of stuff. There's the gothic horror, more of the vampire world, the darkness. More, horror movie kind of slasher stuff. So I think getting everybody on board with that. And then what other ways do you think it's important to kind of, to set that mood, to keep that mood at the table? And at times when and how to break that mood? Any thoughts?
I think humor, especially nowadays, there's this, there's the British dry. There's the gallows humor. That kind of stuff is, I think, important and is not out of place in a horror game.
Right.
I think humor is one of the best ways to break the mood. But the trick with that is being able to have that humor break the tension, but then being able to get back into it. I think that responsibility is not just on the GM, but on the players as well. In the midst of just horrible, catastrophic terror, having some of that humor breaks the tension, especially for the audience, anyone who's listening to. But then being able to get back into the game. I think being able to break it, but then get back into it is the most important thing with that.
Definitely. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I have found that times that I have run horror games, the humor actually helps with the pacing too, because you can have a situation where if it gets heavier and heavier and heavier, your players start to tune out of it because it gets uncomfortable. And when you have that humor, it brings everybody back down into an anchored, normal, we're all here together, we're still playing a game, we're still friends zone. And it does kind of help you bring everything back into focus. So it's a good tool.
I think that can also, if you have just that horror the whole time, it can be just single tone. It's kind of, it can get boring. It's
too heavy.
And I think if you break it up with some sort of humor or something like that, it actually adds a lot of depth to the characters. It gives them a chance to be more well developed. The movie example I always bring up with this particular conversation is the movie Signs. Yeah. I think that movie is masterful in the way that it balances like the funny scenes with the tense drama. I think the ending of that movie is awful, but 99% of it is like when I was watching that movie for the first time, I thought to myself, this is the best movie I've ever seen. Like, because the way that they balance like the creepy alien in the shed or like, in the corn. And then they've got this really funny scene with like Joaquin Phoenix, like wearing a tinfoil hat, like they go back and forth so well.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think the comedy aspect, when you're often putting your characters in a point of panic, right? When you're working horror, when they have to react to something that's truly terrible, and having that levity kind of break the ice is really important when you're trying to have fun. Because I have played a few games where the horror just keeps going, and at the end, everyone's kind of just quietly sitting around the table, looking at each other like, "Huh, well, I guess that's fun." But in terms of mood, the other thing that I wanted to harken back to, this is really just calling them out because I got to, is Josh
Lighting.
as the mood master. I swear he's trying to seduce us all, but every time we'd be playing like a horror game, he'd turn all the lights down. You could barely read your character sheet, but that you can do things like lighting, you can do things like music. It's harder on the podcast, but we used to do that. We used to open up every White Wolf game we played with Concrete Blonde Bloodletting.
Oh,
and it would just put everyone in that mood, which was really cool.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that we've lost with being a podcast is having ambient music, because that is so important to a game. I would spend hours putting together soundtracks for games. It's so important. And like I would, basically get that Danny Elfman greatest hits for every like spooky horror movie game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's humor is that great tension breaker, and I think, and we've done this in other arcs that even aren't horror, and the Dark Legacy was probably we consider that a horror arc. The humor doesn't always have to be like in character. That's what we do most with our table talk, right? Is you can build that darkness and then relieve the tension of the players, but not necessarily relieve the tension of the characters, because you don't always want to let your characters off the hook.
That's a good point.
There's a time and place for both, but there's a way to do that. But then, and that comes back to the session zero of like, if the goofballery kind of starts to spool on itself, you can kind of lose the heart completely. So everybody has to have that buy-in of like, we're trying to get back to kind of having this horror dark experience and doing it together because it's fun, and then knowing that there's that pressure relief valve of
right.
a well-placed joke or a attempted to be well-placed joke.
Definitely. It's almost like having a rating. Like in a movie, you would have certain events can happen or not happen based on the rating of the movie. It's kind of like that with the other direction too. There's a certain level of humor you can allow before it derails people. So you can have it where, this type of immersion is okay to break so that we can continue to play, but you're not just getting wacky and talking about pizza toppings and doing a jig in the corner or whatever you might be doing. So it definitely, that balance is very key. I agree with that. Totally.
Yeah.
Have you guys found that table talk is different in a horror game versus a classic fantasy RPG? Is there a different sort of, if you have everyone buying in, do you find that the table talk is a little bit less, or do you find that maybe are people trying to sort of escape the reality, the verisimilitude a little bit more? Curious if that just came up, if you had an experience with.
We were just talking about this, Josh.
I think maybe if anything, it can lessen it a little bit when you're in those good scenes, and that's not exclusive to horror. Like if you're in a great dramatic moment between characters role playing in any kind of, genre of game, but especially in horror, because there is that balancing act of like, when you're starting to feel like the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like, I don't want it to necessarily go away too fast,
But we were talking about how in Devin's game, we feel like there's a lot less table talk than our other games, right?
Yes.
And Devin's game is, I would consider it a horror game. It's,
Yeah.
And there's a lot less table talk in your game than I'm used to. And I think a lot of it is because I don't want to break the mood.
We spend a lot of time in that game, a lot of times just between the GM, the handler, and one character. There are home scenes in that game where you have characters pursuing things outside of their sort of mission with Delta Green. So there's lengths of time where it's just the handler and one player talking. I mean, that stuff, I think it's some of the best stuff that we've done. The operations are cool. They're fast and they're snappy, but those home scenes are times where it's like really in depth looking into the characters, the introspection by the characters, but also I like to pose some tough questions to the players.
Yeah. And it might also be that if you're a player who's not part of that one-on-one, you don't want to interrupt it with table talk. That
Right.
just feels rude.
Yeah.
But even Josh recently ran a game that was kind of horror themed. I don't know if I'm allowed to say it because Josh recently ran the beginning of Ravenloft's Istrahd. What is it called?
Curse of
Strahd. And I feel like that had a lot less table talk as well. And I think it was because of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's because you knew Strahd was paying attention to you, so no.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I think table talk, like intrinsically, is easier when you're physically around a table.
Sure.
And Kevin, you can probably talk to that most. Well, for one thing, I know that you've mentioned before that you don't necessarily love table talk. I don't know how much that you mean that in your own games or in podcasts you listen to, but you gravitate towards more, and I think you create more games that are focused on the story with less of those distractions. Is that because of your personal preference or the type of games you're running, or also the fact that you're doing a lot of it remotely?
Actually, I think it actually goes hand in hand. I think on the one hand, there is, my personal preference to the way that I GM, the way that I tell stories. It does end up being less table talk because certain game masters have certain types of narrative level that they contain. Some are going to have a lot of descriptions. Some are just going to sit back, let the players lead everything, and certain systems lead for or against that. But I've always been a very descriptive narrative type DM or GM, and so you have a situation where it tends to be players listen more. When you get online, what I tend to find is that actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the games that I record online tend to not have the camera video feature going. And so there is, I think, a little bit more of people not having so much table talk because they're actually not sure when anybody else is going to talk. On the one hand, it's actually really difficult to do that because you don't have that feedback from people while you're interacting with them. So it's difficult to, you'll have moments where you'll stop GMing and then there'll be a 30-second pause and then 4 people all talk. And that's difficult. But I think with the remote recording, there is a little bit of that latency to try to, not interrupt people, to not jump in on the narrative type of situation. But my personal preference, so it depends. I think, again, it's that level you want to get in terms of how much story, how much table talk you want. Certain games lead more to others, I think. You can have some that are very immersive and some that are more lighthearted. So
Cool. So I have a couple little prompting things I want to throw out. And one is, one question I want to get into is talking about systems, game systems, things like that. But before we jump into that, I want to talk about more just in style or theme of games and why you want to play horror. Like, why to put horror in role-playing games? Is it because you like it? What are there styles of games by when I say genre, there's a lot of things on top of it being horror. Is it because it plays well with mystery? Is it because it plays well, in a game that's set in the 1870s where the technology isn't there? So, what aspects of a game, do you start out and say, I want to do horror and then figure it out from there? Or are there types of games that horror can kind of get itself into more? It's a kind of wide open fucking prompting question.
Well, I know for me personally, the thing I find satisfying about running a horror game is the reaction that it invokes in the players. The most satisfying thing I think as a game master is to look around at your table and see that everyone is invested, that people are kind of on the edge of their seats, or they're reacting to the spooky monster Devin is passing a nasty gram.
Wow. GM round table nasty gram.
Yeah, so to me, that's what it's all about. That's why I go for a horror game. It's because I want to get that reaction from my players because that's satisfying. There's a quote by John Carpenter that horror is a reaction. It is not a genre. And I think that is very true.
Love
I like that.
Mm-hmm. I think for me personally, when I've run games or even when I've played in them, I think horror is you want to have fun in your games. You want to tell a good story, and then you want stakes in your game. And it's always been a very it's a very easy way to create stakes. And that fear of the unknown as well. It's a naturally compelling narrative to have that. And one of the things that it gets harder and harder to do is also surprise your players, especially for our group when we've been playing so long. And, all the old tropes are out there. There's lots of content that they've watched. There's lots of content that you've created for them. Having horror or using horror to bend things the way that they're not meant to be bent, whether they're monsters or people or stories or concepts, it's really useful kind of crowbar in terms of creating the element of surprise for your players. Because I think we were talking about this, Jake. One of the things that you like to do is take something that they know and then turn it, switch it, make it so it becomes unknown. And that little bit of unknown or mystery is what I think really keys people into your game and gets them tied in.
I saw this really awesome short video on Instagram or something, and it was these kids at a haunted house, and there was a scary clown, and it was behind a barricade, and they're just laughing at it, and then he climbed over the barricade and they lost their mind because he broke the fourth wall, right? He changed the rules. Mm-hmm. And when you subvert people's expectations like that, that is such a good way to invoke that feeling of horror.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny you said that because I actually worked security one fall at we have a thing here in Michigan called the Terrified Forest. And it's basically
awesome.
Yeah, it's a whole forest that somebody has, and there's it's like a haunted house, but it's outside. And I worked security with it one year with a buddy of mine, and you would see that there'd be the person would be standing there ready to scare the people walking through, and they'd be laughing, making fun of it. And the second they quote unquote started acting, people would lose their shit. It was hilarious. But it's definitely funny. You mentioned something that I totally agree with horror is something that I really love about it, and why I think it's exciting is just like you said, it gets everybody comfortable with the idea of here we are telling a story, and it slowly peels away all that comfort. You take if you look at a horror movie, for example, you can take away, okay, they go to the old creepy house because their car doesn't work. So now they don't have a way to get away. And then the power goes out. So now they can't see anything. And then, there's a creepy dog in there. I don't know. And so it slowly peels away all that comfort level to where everybody is forced to deal with the stuff they don't want to deal with. And,
and to your point right there is it's advancing, right?
Yeah.
You can use it to really advance your story and move your plot along.
So Devin, I want to hear from you because this was funny. When I asked Devin if he wanted to be a part of this, I was like, oh, this will be cool. He'll probably be into this. He's running this Delta Green game. It's super fucking creepy. He's done a great job with it. And he was like, yeah, I'd love to. And he's like, it's actually funny. I don't really like horror. I don't like horror as a genre of movies, things like that. So I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm like that too. I'm a huge wuss. I tell people all the time, I don't watch horror movies. I don't like any of that stuff. So yeah, I feel for you, Devin.
Yeah, I think Dan was saying, all the tropes are out there. In the age of the internet, we've all seen the movies. We've all, whether it's a TV show or a video game or things like that. I think horror in pop culture is sort of, we've seen it all at this point. And I like, actually, I was talking with Jake. I had stopped in for lunch and I'd caught Jake earlier last week. And we talked about the unknown. So I don't like horror, but I like exploring the unknown, especially, things, if you have a good group of players, even if the players have context, they'll get themselves into character where their characters are not familiar with these things. But I like the idea of, like what Kevin was saying, is peeling back things, take things that you know and are comfortable with and are sure of, and then just slowly eroding away that certainty. In terms of game systems, I like the investigative game where it's not about fighting the monster. It's not about, in a lot of cases, especially with Delta Green, it's not about solving the crime. It's simply about staving off the horror, staving off the unknown. And the more that you confront it, the more that your story progresses and advances. The less sure the less sure you are that you can even do it. I like making things uncomfortable for players. I like investigating things. I like answering a question with another question. I think that kind of stuff, especially in collaborative storytelling, is more, I think, conducive to role play and improvisation. In any horror game, I would challenge anyone, any GM looking to run a horror game, I would challenge them to have a plot right away, because you have no idea where the player is going to take it. And as you peel away some of these layers of certainty, you don't know what you're going to get, especially with games where we have in Delta Green, I know in Call of Cthulhu, and even in the game system in the Dark Legacy, you have this willpower, you have sanity, you have these things that erode the mental state of the characters. And from then, who knows where the story is going to go. It may go in an entirely different direction. You're going to, again, take things that are normal. This is my idea of a character. This is who they are. I think this is the progression of them. And then something changes, whether it's stuff through the game or you just have this, idea where I think this is going to set the mood a little bit more. And then, it's true collaborative storytelling where you have no idea where the story is going to go and how it's going to end.
Yeah, I think if there's one of the things I think is most fundamental to running a horror game, and it kind of reminds me of the Carpenter quote you said, Jake, is, what is it? Horror is not a genre, it's an experience.
A reaction.
A reaction.
Yeah.
I think, so if you have the dead rising from their graves and attacking you, well, if you give everyone swords and superpowers and spells, maybe that's not horror. That's a hack and slash. Mm-hmm. So for horror, you have to be on the short stick of the power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think good horror, or really any horror that feels like horror, you have to not be in control. You have to not have the power to overcome, whether because you don't have the supernatural abilities or whether it's because you really lean into the mystery and you don't have the understanding.
There's a hard balance there, though, of making it feel like a desperate situation and fully making the players feel like they're not in control. Because I feel like if you go too far, then it's not really an enjoyable experience as a role-playing game. Because a lot of people play role-playing games to be these kind of great heroic characters and stuff like that. And it's not necessarily fun to be helpless and to just
hopeless.
be like, tortured.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that might be something that you discuss with your players in session
100%.
0.
Yeah,
where
definitely.
you say, hey, we're running a horror game. There was actually a quote, one of the podcast networks I listen to, Glass Cannon podcast, one of their cast members, I don't know if this was his idea or a quote from someone else, but the primary difference between fantasy and horror is the character's ability to fight back.
Yeah.
And I thought that breaks it down in such a simple way that, again, what Josh said, if there's a horde of zombies rising from the ground, but you have a cleric and you have a fighter with a +4 sword, that's a pretty cool hack and slash sort of dungeon crawler.
I kind of want to push back on that a little because I think that's in the context of the story, right? Because if you're talking about, agency and characters being able to do something, a lot of the times the way I think about horror, and before we discussed this topic, I was looking at the genre horror and in movies and things like that. And a lot of topics talk about how the suspense is more important than the jump scare. The suspense is what creates all of the things that we've been talking about so far. And I think you can build a lot of that no matter what the power of your players, so to speak. But to your point, Josh, I will say that I feel like horror packs a better punch in games set in more of a reality setting versus a fantasy setting. Yeah. And whether that's that power scale or that's just what we know, I don't know what that is, but.
Well, I think there's something like in different perspectives on it, but like at the end of the day, to be horror, your players have to feel fear. Mm-hmm. Your characters, at least, or maybe both.
Yep.
You can play D&D and you can go into a red dragon's lair, a legendary red dragon, but like you can try to role play that your characters are afraid. Most people usually don't choose to do that, but it's very rare in D&D or most fantasy games to really play up that element. And I don't know how much of it is it the power dynamics or is it all the other fluff, all the other stuff around the game?
I think that the thing to remember, though, is that there are different kinds of horror. Essentially, there's internal and external horror, right? So with your external threats, it can be harder in a role-playing game if you have these powerful characters to deal with an external threat. But if it's an internal threat, then they can be, and it might actually be a more interesting story if they are these super powerful characters, if they're dealing with an internal trauma. And games like Vampire is the best example I can think of, but Delta Green, all these games that have a sanity or a humanity rating or something like that.
Hunger in Vampire.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's what it is it's dealing with the internal conflict of becoming the beast or becoming the monster or overcoming the insanity or the horror or whatever. And it can be very interesting to see a super powerful vampire dealing with that and trying to keep their humanity, like they can go fuck up a red dragon, but like at the end of the day, like can they keep who they are intact? And that's a more nuanced story to tell in a role-playing game. But I think it's my favorite kind of games is when you're really, the struggle is internal and it's on the players. Dan, you ran a game where we were struggling to get through the Underdark with a bunch of like escorting a bunch of like NPC peasants and
out of the abyss.
No, they were out of a work camp.
We had like no food or anything, and we ended up having to eat people who died. And that, it was an internal conflict. Like it was.
No one held up their X card for cannibalism. All right. So,
but like
Bob was literally on the table.
You can do it. It's just, it's harder. I think when you sit down and you've already done your session 0 and you've got your candles lit and your music on, you need to ask yourself, like, is this an external or an internal threat that is making this horror? And what kind of characters would be interesting in that situation?
Yeah. What I just want to, one other anecdote actually from Jake's game, you'll remember this, Josh, is I don't know if it was specifically horror, but it creates that sense of it, is that this is previous to the game that we played. Jake had taken us aside and told us at one point that we were all going to play our characters in a certain way towards another player. So what had happened, a mind flare had taken control of one player, and in his imagination, we all behaved in a way counter to our characters. And it was a real watching our friend John sit at the table and like trying to figure out what was happening was a really cool mind-bending thing.
To be clear, as players, John was the only one that didn't know that this was
correct.
afoot.
Yes. Yes.
John said that's the best game he's ever played.
Sure.
Nice. Well, to go back to what you were saying, Jake, is what I find really interesting about your internal struggle with these powerful characters is the idea of power is kind of scary to a certain extent. People who sometimes are given the ability to do things, sometimes if they don't know how to control that, that's scary too. A type of external horror could be the struggle as to what is the right and wrong choice to make with the power that you have. And that could be really, really interesting to see too, when you're able to, look at Superman, he's able to destroy cities and buildings, but he doesn't. But if he were to lose control, that probably would be pretty terrifying to him. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, the first thing I thought when you started saying about the scariness of powers is like, I wish I saw that in more like Marvel movies, you know? Like,
Right.
I wish I saw that explored more.
Yeah, like the Incredible Hulk, for example, is a prime. You know, they kind of touch on a little bit with the way they do it in the MCU with Mark Ruffalo, where he's doesn't want to lose control and he's constantly trying to have that struggle. But we don't really see the full blown effects of, oh man, I made a mistake and I want to, come back from that.
The Red Dragon example. As gamers, we all know what a Red Dragon can do. The breath weapon, bite, claw, tail, wing attack, right? But when you have these things like sanity and hunger and things like that, when a character, one of these powerful heroes, quote unquote, loses control, we don't know what they can do. We don't know what they're capable of. I think that especially in horror games, people can be some of the most terrifying. In our Delta Green game, I think we've only encountered one sort of
no spoilers,
extraordinary entity. A lot of other things, a lot of these other really creepy, dark things are caused by humans. And I think maybe that's what I like. Maybe that's what I don't like about horror, is that it's always some alien thing or outside influence. But when you have people who sort of go over the edge or go too far, that is truly terrifying. That evokes that reaction.
One of my favorite shows of all time is The X-Files.
Yeah.
And every supernatural fucking craziness happens in that show, and I love a lot of them. I love, the monster of the week with this vampire kind of thing, this weird parasite kind of thing. But some of my favorite episodes are the ones that leave the ambiguity, at least, of like, is that just a person? Is it, or ties it so closely to human nature because at the end of the day, most people, don't really believe in all of it, or if they do, they're not sure. But the world is full of horror and the world is full of people. So I think coming back to that, I think that's a good way to bring it home, right? Because we know what a red dragon is, but like I've never walked into a red dragon's lair.
Of course not. Why would you?
It's what Scooby-Doo taught me, that every monster is just an old man trying to get more money.
There you go.
Old white man. So we've hit around this a few times, and so let's just kind of jump into it before we get into some more discussion stuff of the mechanics. People have mentioned some specific mechanics, specific systems. How and why is the game system you choose important in running a good horror game? What game systems have you run that you think are inherently great at that? What are ones that are maybe difficult to do that in, and why?
Oh yeah.
I think the most important thing to maintaining that mood is checking the rule book as little as possible.
Amen.
Right.
Maintaining that mood. You can run. I think you can run a horror game with a group of players who are invested in a GM who is able to set that mood. You can almost any game system you can run a horror game, but it's maintaining that. It's not checking the rule book. That goes back to like table talk. You're going to have a lot less table talk when you're not taking breaks to check the rules for 5 minutes. You don't have to have that bringing everyone back into the table. If you can just keep the action flowing, keep the mood going, the rising, falling actions, you can, I think any game system, you can run a horror game.
Absolutely. I agree with that. A system that I really love that's like that is a system called Dread. I'm not sure if you have played it, if the listeners have heard of it.
No, never heard of it.
It's pretty common at this point, but it's basically, the whole concept is you're regular type people. Your character sheet, quote unquote, is you answer some questions that have to do with the story you're about to tell. And as you play, all of the success and failure that you have is based on pulling blocks out of a Jenga tower. And so you have no rules. Yeah,
that's
so
real dread.
No rules. Yeah, right. You have no rules other than being good at Jenga. So you have a situation where what happens is,
Jake, you're fucked.
I think John was talking about this game. It sounds cool.
Oh, it's super cool. But as it goes along, just like when you're playing Jenga, that tower gets more and more and more unstable, and that suspense, that terror, that horror grows as you play it because you're losing less and less of the control that you do have. And when the Jenga tower falls, when your character pulls it, you die. So it's really spectacular, and there's a whole, and it's really immersive because you can see, oh no, it's gonna fall, and you just get away, and it's fun to use that with the narrative. What I'll do is when people are trying to pull, I'll keep narrating. And, he's getting closer, and it's about to grab you. I make them more and more freaked out as it goes along.
Does everyone have their own Jenga tower, or is there like a communal Jenga tower?
The default is there's a communal shared one, but I've seen alternate ways to play it where there's separate ones that are already pre pulled blocks, so it's different configurations. So you can't have I plan to pull this one. Well, now you can't do that because you're on a different tower, and so it's But
that's a real commitment to Jenga too. I mean, that guy probably works for Jenga. He's probably making wood blocks in his garage.
They're trying to bring it back.
I think that what that really is doing, a system like that, is you're building a rule set around invoking a feeling. And we've talked about this before. Anytime that you have a rule in a game that pushes the narrative or pushes like a certain emotion, then that's a great rule. And those are kind of things that we look for, I think, when we're trying to pick systems. I think,
to your point, Devin, is that, and what we've kind of talked about all along, is that the suspense is the genesis of the story, because it's them uncovering things or trying to make sense of things. And that progression, doesn't necessarily have to be violent or, conflict oriented. It can be very progressive. It can be very kind of mysterious.
Internal sometimes.
Yeah, internal sometimes. Absolutely. And I think that's what lends itself, horror, the genre lends itself to so many different gaming systems, is because all of that lead up is just good storytelling and good player, role playing. And then the stuff that happens kind of at the end, you do want it to be a surprise. You do want it to be fun, but there's a lot of systems out there that you can do that with. So, but to the few games that I have run, at least for us, I did like running kind of a cosmic horror game, and I did that actually in Star Wars, which was fun. And Jake, you've run a horror game in Star Wars too, which was one of my favorites. But in terms of systems, those were just kind of interesting outliers.
I mean, I do think some of the stuff you guys talked about earlier, ultimately, I agree with you, Devin, that if you have, if you don't burden yourself with the rules entirely and you have people bought in around the table, you can do it with anything. However, I do think there are systems that can assist you in those things, that can assist you in getting into that mind space. And I think one of the biggest, you guys have talked about already, but having something on your character sheet that reflects that internal piece, not the hit points, not your stats, but, a sanity, a willpower, a condition, a dementia, those things that can help you get into that role playing of like, you experience this thing, make a sanity check. You fail, you lose, roll 1d6, lose that sanity. Because then it's like, obviously we all want to role play well, we're all getting into our characters, but it's just a way to kind of assist that of like, wow, I just experienced this thing, and my sanity, who I am as a person, is now less.
Yeah. You should talk about what you did for Strahd.
Yeah. So, hopefully that will be heard at some point, but that was something that I did struggle with D&D, because I think D&D can, for me at least, sometimes be hard to stay with horror, because it usually comes down to like your characters can fight and beat most things. And if they can't, then you just lose and you kill characters. So how do you make it so, well, maybe you can still win, you can still get through, but there's repercussions of that beyond just the role playing. So we introduced, I think we called it Spirit. So we basically gave a new score. It was the average of your three mental stats. So we said, add up your intelligence, your wisdom, and charisma, divide it by 3. That's your Spirit score. That's not an attribute you roll off, but that's a number. Now, different things will happen, and then I would make characters make a roll, and I would use those 3 attributes. You know, I would use intelligence if it was something that was like mind warping that would change your perception of something. Wisdom when it would more, kind of affect your drive, your morale, and charisma was a little bit more kind of like your soul, your spirit, like, and using those as a mechanical thing, and then seeing that spirit score go down and putting thresholds in to then give a condition. Like, okay, you get to this point, I'm going to give you a lasting condition that's going to,
I see dead people.
Use that in the role-playing game. So I don't think it's necessary, but I do think games that have those elements can be a big assist in running a horror game.
Yeah, the place where it kind of fails, though, is when you're running a one-shot. When you're running a shorter form game, it's hard for that to feel impactful. Like, Kevin, I know you ran like a very short Cthulhu game, and which has a sanity system. Yeah. But you just gave players like a temporary negative if they failed their checks. Because, I mean, obviously it wasn't going to be a long enough thing where they had dementias and eventually went insane, right?
Yeah. The payoff for that is when you're doing something short, you definitely have to make it what happens gets resolved during that. So when you're doing a one shot, you can't take the time to build and build and build into this deterioration that Josh is talking about. You have to actually resolve that then. And so, it's easier to, from what I've experienced anyway, it's easier to just have there be immediate concerns. Things like, you can't roll as high, you have a penalty, or some of your abilities don't work quite the same way. Your DC goes up, whatever it might be based on whatever system you're using. But it needs to be immediate. That way they feel that dread. They feel that sake of, I'm losing my character's abilities. And that can be scary to a lot of players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Has anyone watched the Netflix series Mindhunter?
Yes, it's very good.
This was one of our prompting questions. I'm going to just shoehorn in a little bit, but sort of inspirations for horror. And what I got from that show is the most terrible things with, they're interviewing these serial killers. The dialogue is really well done, but the most like gut-wrenching some of the most gut-wrenching scenes in that show is seeing how the work of the behavioral analysis unit is seeing how their work affects their home life, their family life, their relationship with their friends and family. I think that stuff, if you're doing a more longer form game, like Delta Green, there are things in that game with bonds, and you can, instead of taking sanity damage for your character, project that damage onto your bonds. And I think in terms of, again, setting that mood is showing how these experiences affect the characters outside of those operations. I think as we go further along in our Delta Green game, we'll see more of, how are the characters changing because of the things that they're seeing? How is their relationships with their friends, with their family? How is that stuff affected? And that stuff is really, it evokes that reaction. That's really this is horrible. The characters feel it. All the players who are watching that character deteriorate, seeing how their relationships are fail. That stuff is really, really. I think that's the stuff that I think I really like exploring that.
Yeah.
And not in a game system that facilitates that. That might not be something, especially for someone new to horror or new to running games, might not know how to implement those things. I think having a game system that sort of facilitates that says, hey, if the character if they're going to take sanity damage, they can instead project it onto their bonds. So you can start to see how these terrible experiences affect them in other ways besides hit point damage or disorders and things like that.
If everyone had to say one game system, though, that they would love, or, it doesn't have to be the only game system you'd run horror in, but one that you really like, go around, say which system it is. Devin?
I mean, they should start paying me. Delta Green, Delta Green by Arc Dream Publishing.
All right.
It's based off of the Call of Cthulhu system, so
Okay,
it's
cool.
D100.
Mhm.
It's really strongly like it promotes investigation and things like that. And the big damage I think we've had. I'm not going to spoil it, but a big a fear is losing sanity damage. And the more that you investigate, the more that you learn, the more that the more the void looks back into you, so to speak.
Yeah.
How are you, Jake?
Okay, well, let's let
Oh,
let's
yeah,
let our
Kevin.
guest
Yeah,
go
yeah.
first.
A game that I love is actually a game that I've actually played on my show. Shameless plug. It's called It Wants Souls. It's if you imagine The Conjuring or Amityville Horror or these types of movies as a role playing game. So it kind of has the same premise every time you play it. Of you're a family who is in a new home, and there's the outsider, an entity. It could be whatever you want within the story confines that is trying to slowly erode you, steal one of you away, whatever it might be. What I like about it with the horror aspect is it's modern typically, and it's not very rules heavy. It's just basically you go around, there's scenes that you each tell, you narratively go through a scene, and at the end of the scene, you roll to determine whether or not this outsider character has successfully hurt your family, messed with your sanity, inflicted terror, they call it. And what's really fascinating about it is the outsider rolls more dice than you do. So you're always got the deck stacked against you. So you're always struggling the whole game. And it's immersive. It's a fun game.
Cool.
Makes me think of Paranormal Activity too. Sort of that found footage. Like you just see a couple of weird things, but it's just this thing. It's just this outside force that's slowly just creeping in people's lives. Awesome.
Yeah.
I would probably go with the original World of Darkness setting. It's pretty easy to play. The rules are pretty easy to learn. It has that humanity or willpower, depending on what kind of creature you are, system. So that internal conflict is completely optional. And it's robust enough that you can do a lot of different things with it. You can change the setting, the time period. You can really tailor it to what you want. Anyone who listens to the show a lot probably thought I was going to say Monster of the Week because I've talked about how much I love that game. The problem with Monster of the Week, though, is it's exactly what it says on the front, right? It's Monster of the Week. It's meant to be an external threat. So it works great for those type of games, but kind of only those type of games. And my biggest complaint about Monster of the Week, which I keep coming back to whenever I'm going to run a game, is that all the characters are very like kind of high fantasy. Like there's a lot of magic and godlike powers and stuff like that. And a lot of times that just doesn't work. And one thing that's great about World of Darkness is you can have that stuff or you can leave it by the wayside very easily.
It's another 2d6 system, Jake.
World
of Darkness.
World of Darkness is D10s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's what we use for Dark Legacy. Well, the newer, the 5e version.
Yeah. Which I'm just not sure if I love it as much as the older one.
Yeah. What about you, Dan? You asked the question.
Yeah, I think I haven't actually run a game with it, but I just listening to Harlow Falls, one of the first games that you guys actually podcasted, an RPG live play with Dean and over at LSG, and that was Monster of the Week. And I thought it was really effective at creating that suspense, at creating that drama. And that was pretty low fantasy. There were some elements of like psychic abilities, I think, with one of the characters. But overall, the build and a lot of the things that happened where you just weren't sure if it was something else versus something kind of normal was a really cool build. And the system seemed to carry that pretty well.
I think one of the great things about Monster of the Week too is that it's a good starter drug.
Yeah.
If you have somebody who doesn't have like World of Darkness is pretty fucking heavy.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yes.
if you have someone who's doesn't know anything about that genre beyond like watching some movies with vampires in it, it's a pretty dark, fucked up, very
Big. It's a big world.
big
Yeah.
world, and like you kind of have to know a lot about it, and it's real Anne Ricey black nail polish kinda,
Right up my alley.
Yeah.
which and I love it, and we grew up playing it.
Yeah.
But I think Monster of the Week is very accessible. And you're right, Jake. Like it was the game that actually that 1940 game that planning to run with Devin. I was going to use Monster of the Week until we started playing Delta Green. I said I think this would be better, but to do a lot of horror with it, I think it helps to cut out some of those more supernatural elements depending on the style of game you want to play. I hate to say it, but like I don't have an original idea here. After playing Delta Green a little bit, right now that's where like my head is at for if you want to run like horror, especially like investigative horror, how the mechanics work and the elements that are there to not just personify the horror, go beyond it, your home life, your bonds. I mean, it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, no new ideas over here.
They don't have to
You'll
be
have
new
to
if
go.
they're good. Yeah.
Have you guys ever played Knights Black Agents at all? Because that game is pretty solid too. It uses the gumshoe system, and it's basically your spies who are fighting a secret war with vampires, and so it's pretty cool. But it's like that though. It's investigatory, and you can break down your bonds with people that you have because you don't think you get killed by vampires or used against you or whatever might be going on. But it's cool.
That's a similar premise to Delta Green. Delta Green, the premise of the game is that you're a government organization, sort of at the is the bulwark between the unknown and human society. So I like that
Beautiful.
stuff. The X-Files, True Detective, seeing the people who are on the forefront of this fight against this extraordinary threat.
Yeah.
Well, Devin, you kind of already touched on this, bringing this up. Inspiration. That's something I thought would be cool to talk about when you're thinking about a horror game. Where do you guys look for inspiration? Specific things or formats, video games, movies, TV, short stories. Like where do you look for to kind of get your juices flowing when it comes to horror and your tabletop?
Oompa Loompas. I mean,
I'll start. Yeah, Oompa Loompas. Truly terrifying.
Yes.
I like to look at stuff that it isn't really marketed as horror. Archive 81 comes to mind. That's a show on Netflix based on a podcast. It starts off slow. It's weird. But then these things start happening that eventually snowball into something really awful and terrifying. Actually, I was thinking about sort of inspirations of like modern horror versus classic horror. I think classic horror follows some of those tropes, where there's, the evil thing that, the Jason, Freddy, the vampires and stuff like that. But I think some of the modern ideas of more of that internal conflict with people and how they're reacting to things that may seem innocuous, but as they experience, one or two of these sort of just strange things, how their mental state deteriorates and that type of horror, that internal conflict rather than external. There's a game called Alien Isolation that is this.
Love it.
It's so good. The way that they set the mood. I mean, the music changes and you don't see any danger, but the music changes. The danger music comes on and you just start sweating. Your heart rate rises. Where's the danger? But again, I think I look for things that are slow burns. I like to, pay attention to every detail because there's a lot of these little small details that end up becoming, evoking. You see this thing that is normal. You like this, it's a cup of coffee, but eventually, someone goes into a room or a building or a house or wherever it's been abandoned. There's a hot cup of coffee on the table, and it's like, that's kind of weird. And things like that. I think symbolism, and I look for things that aren't necessarily in your face horror and stuff that just makes you feel a little bit weird. Because I think, those are the things I like to pick and choose from when I'm when I'm thinking about, running a game.
Subtlety.
Yes. Yep.
Well, that's why David Lynch is so successful. It's all of his stuff is like that. It's all
just makes you feel
yeah,
weird.
it's just unsettling. Like everything about it is just like, what am I really seeing here? Yeah, definitely. I always like to kind of dip into real stories, local legends, urban myths, those types of things that are like we kind of briefly touched on earlier. Things that are rooted in reality, because to me that's much scarier. I mean, a lot of people can rationalize, okay, there's a ghost. Well, we know ghosts aren't real, so it's like, well, I don't know, maybe that's up for debate for some people, but we could rationalize ghosts away, but what we can't rationalize away is that guy murdered his wife and his kids, and so that's much more terrifying because that guy lived next door as opposed to a ghost that's made up. So you look for the newspaper. Lots of good stuff there.
Yeah,
The Weekly World News.
Yeah, right.
Dan, Jake, you got any?
Dan?
I think a lot of my inspiration, and it's a way I've kind of built story ideas before, is usually from a specific event that I see or something that maybe an interpretation of something that I hadn't thought of, and then introducing that to my game and trying to play off of it. One was like for example, in the Choose Your Own Adventure that I just ran, where I made everyone blind. That came from the idea of A Quiet Place, which was, you couldn't make any noise. And I started thinking about like sensory deprivation or not being able to use your senses. And we've talked about this with escape rooms too. We did an escape room for half an hour, and the entire time we were in the dark.
Ooh.
And it is a very different feeling to be in total darkness. Not like you're trying to stumble around at night and there's a little moonlight. Total darkness is a very different animal. And then trying to work off of things like that. Another idea that recently I used in a game was from the movie Fallen, which I absolutely
Love
love
that movie.
as a horror movie. It's a phenomenal. I don't know if you've seen it, but I won't spoil it with anything more than some of the concepts that they use in that movie are very cool, very subtle, and a really good way to look at things differently.
When it comes to horror inspiration for me, I grew up watching old like episodic horror shows like Twilight Zone and like Tales from the Crypt and stuff like that. And one thing that I think really inspires me about those kind of shows is, for the most part, they are about this internal conflict. Even if there's some crazy monster chasing them or whatever, they often end with the main character kind of losing their mind or something like that.
Or being
like
the monster,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, or that idea of being the monster, and they also usually end with like a pretty awesome twist. So I think I get a lot of inspiration from like especially Twilight Zone, like in that way. When I'm looking at running a horror game, that's kind of my jam. That's what I go to, I think.
Do you like Black Mirror, Jake?
Love it.
Yeah.
So good.
All unique scenarios.
Yeah.
I think that'd be
Yeah.
a good inspiration for anyone looking for something horrible.
How about you, Bruins?
Well, I mean, for media, there's a lot of things. I will say, honestly, for me, maybe it's like an only child with an overactive imagination. Like sometimes I like to kind of freak myself out with like what ifs. And like this little idea will pop in my mind of like, I get up in the middle of the night, I go to take a piss, I come back in my room. What if my fucking stereo was on and playing like an Ella Fitzgerald song? Like I think of something that would just, and this really goes to what Devin was saying, the things that aren't like a ghost flies in the room, but something that is, a normal event in a extraordinary way.
I don't know if you remember, Josh. We were kids. We were at Levin's house, and we were going to ride our bikes to your house. And we were going up Levin's driveway, and we saw a pair of like red, orange glowing eyes. Ooh. This wasn't like light reflecting in it. It was true like glowing eyes. And we froze on the driveway. We just froze there, and we're like whispering to one another, trying to figure out like, and I don't know, we're like 8 years old maybe. And we're trying to figure out what this could be. And we're like, well, we'll just keep going, but they move a little.
Ooh.
And then we're like, okay, we're going to go back. And then the next day we saw that someone had lit a fire in the field, like a big brush fire. And there were embers in it that were still glowing when we went through there at midnight, 1
That
a.m.
reminds me, I want to play the role-playing game Kids on Bikes.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to play that.
But I think for media, it's things, and kind of one of the questions I was going to throw out, and maybe Devin's already hit on this. I think one of the hardest things to me to visualize as like a GM or a storyteller is how to do like lasting games, because I think for me, when I'm looking for inspirations, or even when I'm coming up with like an idea for horror, it's always about the beginning. Like for tabletop horror, I want my players to know and to be bought into the fact that we're doing a horror game, but the characters to have no idea that they're in a horror game.
Yes.
Right? Like your fighter and your wizard can know that they're in a fantasy game.
Yeah.
The pilot and the smuggler can know they're in a sci-fi game. But for a horror game, the best horror for me, like one show I watched recently, maybe a couple years ago, The Outsider.
Yep.
It was a mini series, I think HBO,
really
based on a Stephen King short with Jason Bateman.
Yep.
And it's that like somebody investigating something and then it becomes something else. That's the shit that like really gets me hooked. And but that's also like a big limitation for me of like that's the part I always want to go back to. I always want to go back to the beginning, the first experiencing it. And I tend to lose my creative juices once the characters know that like this shit exists, like it's harder for me to come up with ideas.
Sure.
And maybe that's a question of like, is that something that you can overcome and how do you do it? Or is it just like, that's sort of a genre that some people like to stick to?
Maybe horror, shorter games are better. It might just be, or for you at least.
Yeah, I think horror it's almost like a drug, really. I mean, you have that initial first scare. I mean, you're talking about when you were a kid, you got terrified of embers in a field. And nothing really ever in your life might ever live up to that initial time you were terrified. And it's like that with a horror game. If you start strong, it's very terrifying. Everybody's bought in. That's really all you need. You can keep that tension going for a one shot a lot easier than say, we're going to play I'm going to use Delta Green as your example here. We're going to play Delta Green for the next 5 years. Well, it might be difficult to build that tension up and down for 5 years, as opposed to a 4 or 5 episode or one night only type of event.
Yeah, that's sort of I think the story of a horror story should be constrained by the mental state of the characters. I think at some point for real horror, they either, effective horror, the characters either get away or they go insane. You were talking, Jake, about how, what was it? The example where at the end of the story, the character just goes mad.
Yeah. A lot of Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah. But I think that's a good format where it's like the whole point of horror is you're testing the limits of the human mind, of the willpower, of the sanity, whatever it is, of the characters. And then once that runs out, being able to sort of end it and say, have you can have a satisfying ending where no one makes it out alive or no one makes it out sane. And then just starting off fresh, you can still play in the same world, but showing horror, showing the stakes like Dan was talking about is establishing stakes where, no one who encounters this stuff makes it out the same way that they went in. And I think if you establish that in a game, whether it's, one night or a short amount of sessions, you can have a long game with different casts of characters, different scenarios, but still maintain that same world. You can still maintain that same mystery and fantasy of this unknown, unseen thing that is out there.
I think if you look at a lot of TV, like horror on TV, it really, I think reinforces this idea because look at the shows that are out there. You've got these anthology series, which are amazing and do these really awesome short stories. And then, you've got these horror shows that drag on for 11 seasons, like The Walking Dead, and it's like it was good at first, and it should have ended 4 seasons ago. You know,
Right. Yep.
like and I think that horror, you need. It's important to know when to end it, right?
Yeah.
With horror,
And-
that's the takeaway.
And to that point too is like X-Files does it really well, but it's always contained, right? It's having that conclusion and getting the relief of it,
Yeah.
it concluding, right?
Well, I'm not a big fan of it, but I know it's hugely popular. Like American Horror Story, like the reason it's
haven't watched
successful, every season is its own contained story. You know, they're not. It would get kind of old if we saw the same characters from season to season, because you start thinking they've got plot armor and how many supernatural things can they experience before we're not invested.
And what's
anymore.
really unique about that one is it's most of the same actors.
Right.
So it's like a role playing game.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
great.
You're
You have
right.
the
you're
same
right.
actors playing new characters coming
Yep.
back for a new story. They can start fresh and go from there.
True Detective as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different.
And The Sinner. I don't know if you've watched that yet.
I have not.
That's got 4 seasons now, and it's really good at creating a situation where you're questioning, is there something else? But then has a really eloquent way of bringing it together and talking about usually the sins of someone and what it's done to the people around them.
So I got a couple prompts I want to end with. One of mine and one from Devin's Nastygram. But before that, any new kind of stuff you guys want to throw out there for prompting questions, for other stuff that throw out for discussion?
I think we've hit on a lot of the things. I mean, we didn't really say it, but we kind of talked about like pacing is so important, right? In games, and you were talking about that kind of slow reveal and you know, not exposing the monster too early or the plot or the slow kind of decline of the characters. But we kind of hit on that. I had pacing written down, atmosphere. We talked about that. Yeah.
Well, before I get to my last one, here's an extra last one from me, which is, let's say you got a group of players or a few players and you want to run a horror game, and some of your players are maybe a little reluctant. And obviously you don't want to force anybody, but how could you pitch playing a horror game to somebody who kind of looks at horror as like, I don't really love horror movies. It's not really my thing. In a role-playing sense, what's your sales pitch on why tabletop role-playing is cool, even if horror tabletop role-playing is cool, even if you don't like it as a genre to consume?
That's a good question, Josh.
It is. I think
Do some rebranding, call it thriller and suspense.
There you go. I think something you might be able to try would be if you actually have, within the reason, of course, you have one of the players maybe be the horror, be the bad guy, be the Michael Myers type character, I guess you could say. So they get to have a invested role the entire time. They're not getting hunted. They're not getting hurt. They're not getting scared. They get to have fun and poke at the people who do like that.
Cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I think possession and character death to drive story is a valuable tool to have in your belt, and that would definitely be a cool way to introduce it for maybe someone who's a little nervous or anxious about it.
I think the best way to do it is to kind of give a couple examples of TV or movie that your game is going to be similar to, like thematically, and that might make them go like, oh, I never really considered that horror, but yeah, that's cool. Like, if you say like, oh, we're going to play a horror game, like, I don't really like horror. And you say, well, it's kind of going to be like The Shining.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I actually love that movie. And like, okay, well, that's kind of horror, but like, it's going to be like that kind of creepy isolation thing. And, if you give them your inspiration, then it might inspire them.
There you go.
I really like Kevin's idea. I think if you have a player who's sort of reluctant to get into horror for whatever reason, you say, hey, how about this? You can be the hidden horror and things like that. I think if a player who's reluctant to do that stuff, if they feel like they have this, a sort of secret opportunity, that they'll have the answers. So maybe the things that they don't like, maybe it's they don't like the surprises, they don't like the uncertainty. Engaging that player and saying, well, what in between sessions or whatnot, you could say, hey, well, what do you think is going to happen next? Getting them engaged, maybe finding out what they like. And like Jake said, maybe there's some other media that they do like that they maybe didn't realize was horror, and get them to draw from that. And then, again, that collaborative storytelling, they get to then have their input on the story and make something their own. I think, empowering people like that.
They were the ones that loved violence against children.
They did. Yeah.
They loved it.
They turned
so you just give them that opportunity.
Yep.
Run away with it.
Yep.
Yeah, one idea I had is instead of pitch it as horror, pitch it as discovery, but discovery of something that is other. And, so if the horror is kind of like they think of like slasher and stabby and ghosts and whatever, do it as like, I want you to uncover something like, that investigative of nature, which, and mechanically, I think that's some of the stuff we've talked about that works really well in these kind of games. So
they think they're playing Star Trek, but actually they're playing aliens.
Yeah. Bingo.
I think that just points to the value of session 0 too, and talking with your players and making sure that everyone is comfortable exploring those themes and topics. Because, I think the worst feeling as a GM is getting, 4 sessions in and realizing that someone is really not feeling what's going on.
Yeah.
And rather than trying to sort of shoehorn that in or try and force something, being being out in the open about what you're going to explore in the game, I think is going to be a more enjoyable experience for everyone.
Nice. So Devin, you passed me an Instagram earlier.
I did.
It was a good one to save till towards the end. So why don't you kick that one out?
Ooh.
So this is something that I deal with a lot. I think not necessarily in horror games, but I run a lot of games that are different people. Kevin, you might deal with this too. But how do you end your game or arc or whatever it is while maintaining a sort of sense of mysticism and fantasy? How many questions do you want to leave the audience with or with the players with? How do you, and especially if you have an ongoing sort of campaign, where I like to run my D&D games sort of in the same world. So I don't want to reveal everything at the end of an arc, but I still want the story to be satisfying for the players. I want them to see their characters sort of actualized or destroyed in a satisfying way. But I want to leave questions. I want to leave the players. I want for you guys on the podcast, you want to leave your audience with sort of a hunger for more. So how do you do that? How do you end a game that is satisfying for the players at the table, satisfying for the audience that are listening to it, that have followed the story the entire way through, but also leaving more room for, for future arcs or, things like that. How do you do it?
I think a big one, at least for me in my relatively limited experience, has been to have, 2 hard choices, to have a dilemma.
Yeah.
And when the characters have to pick one path or the other, it will naturally follow. One path will lead to that conclusion. The other one is left unexplored. And that is a natural hook. That is a natural unknown. And it was chosen that way. So it felt like there were some elements of control in how that turns out and in what remains a mystery, but it's still there. And it does leave you room for the next time, or the repercussions of their actions will inform what the next story is going to be.
Leaves them with what if we had done this?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. What I always try to do is, if we're doing horror, if we're doing mystery, really at the base of it, there's one specific question. And if you just pay off that one specific question, anything else that they might have brought up to ask on their own is still out there. I think what's important for storytelling, whether it's horror or not, is that payoff at the end. You're talking about Walking Dead, for example, should have ended a couple of seasons ago. I'm not going to get into that. I agree. But the example I'm going to use is the TV show Lost. I mean, it got to the point where, I loved that show when it started, but as it went on, you could tell it was like, we don't know where this is going ourselves. And that's where you lose everybody. But the trick is, if you just have one central question, in that case, what is this island all about? Then you can just answer that. And if you answer that successfully, Everything else feels great. Yeah. You
Yeah, that's a good point.
For me, I'll fall back on the same thing I said that was an inspiration and a limitation is, for me, horror is about the initial discovery, going from the world we know or your character's paradigm, whatever it is, if they're in a medieval town, if they're in a space station, their normal and their first experience with other than normal. And at the end of that, having enough resolution, basically finding the iceberg, but having no idea what's below the surface of the water or how far it goes.
Yeah.
And that's where I would try to leave it, of like satisfaction. We've understood part of something, we've experienced part of something, we've overcome it, survived, maybe not. But what else? What else could be out there?
And it doesn't always need to be a monster.
No.
I don't think.
Right.
I think sometimes showing the thing, personifying it, takes away some of that, that mysticism.
I actually, this is not something I've ever really thought about, because I kind of like to wrap my stories up with a little bow. I kind of like to see them fully resolved. And I also like to, a lot of times I will write a game and I do not know how it is going to end, because I don't want to write the ending. I want the players to write the ending.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I have a little oddball to throw out at the end. I actually kind of thought up as we were going of, does anybody have any non-tabletop, real world, creepy experiences, creepy horror, unexplained. Dan, you've already given up the embers. Any kind of cool little quick ghost story you want to share? I can go first because I already thought of one.
Yeah, do it.
And I don't have many, but there's one that it sticks with me a lot. I was about 9 years old. My mom had remarried for about a year or two. I was living in a new town, new group of friends, whatever. And
did you just whatever us?
Yeah. Okay. Some losers that I definitely was not going to be stuck with 30 years later.
Right? Damn.
Yada, yada, yada.
Yada, yada, yada. So, and my this is pre-cell phone, pre-internet, all that, obviously. And my dad called me earlier in the night and said, your grandfather, Brew, we called him, he's in the hospital and it doesn't look good. He's really sick, and we don't know how long he has. And this is kind of like one of my first experiences with death at an age of like understanding it. And it was like, okay, we kind of were talking about maybe trying to get up to the hospital the next day. This was in the evening, and I was pretty upset. I love my grandfather. He had been a little bit sick, but things moved quick. And my mom, my stepdad were like, well, let's watch a movie, something. So we were sitting in the den watching a movie, and we had one dog, this lab, Atticus, who was one of the best dogs of all time. And he was this great, friendly, protective yellow lab. And he was sitting in there, and I was sitting leaning against the couch, and Atticus was at my feet. I was petting him, upset, a little teary, petting the dog, trying to watch the movie, thinking about my grandfather. And all of a sudden, his hackles go up, and he looks towards the open doorway. And Atticus is like super calm, well-adjusted, never like just growls or barks out of nowhere. And we're kind of like, Atticus, you okay? You okay? And like, he starts growling a little bit harder. And my parents like pause the movie, and then he like kind of yelps, and he jumps, and he runs out of the room, tail between his legs. And we're like, what the heck? And we stop, we put the lights on, we walk out of the room, and he'd gone up the stairs, and he's in the corner of the landing of the stairs, curled up in a ball, shivering and shaking like uncontrollably. And we're like, oh my God. Like, so we all come around him. We're like checking on him, lean down, petting him, like trying to calm him down. He's whimpering. And then he slowly starts to calm down. And like, we just sit there with him for like 10, 15 minutes. And like, eventually like we coax him back down, and like we get him down the stairs, and we go back, finish the movie. And then I go to bed and get a call the next morning early before school. My dad calls and says that my grandfather passed away. And it was at like that time.
Ooh.
And Like, you know, they always say, like, I don't believe in ghosts, really, like in any kind of way that like ghost story exists. But I was like, man, that's fucking weird.
Dogs,
Yeah.
That's weird.
Dogs and children have like
You know,
a very
And it could be whatever. He saw that I was upset. But he never did anything like that before or after.
Wow. That is spooky.
What's that vampire rule? Like kids could see through obfuscation or something like that. Something weird.
That's cool. I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Well, I have one. I grew up in Haddonsfield, Illinois, and my brother came back and murdered half the town. Oh wait, no, that wasn't me.
Dear Lord. Oh man.
X card.
No, I have one. I was about probably about 2.5, maybe 3-ish, and my parents, they were still married at the time. They had some friends over, and being in the mid '80s, they were like, "Oh, hey, Ouija board. Let's get this thing out and let's see what it's all about." So it was 4 of them down in the basement. You move it around the planchette, asking questions of this nature. And they were asking it. Now, this part of the story has been lost. This might have been embellished. I don't really know. But they were asking the quote unquote spirits who they came to talk to. And it's spelled out Kevin. And right at that moment, they hear me screaming upstairs. So my dad, his name is also Kevin, coincidentally, he goes bolting up the stairs, goes into my room, and he says I'm sitting completely upright in my bed. And I slowly turn, I look at him, and I just say, "Stop." And
That's awful.
And then laid back down. And he said he was mortified, terrified. So I don't know. Maybe.
Do you remember
something
this?
to that.
Holy
You know,
shit.
I don't remember it, but I do remember around that time having a very vivid dream of being in that house and someone in, kind of like what Josh is talking about, like the doorway just felt like maybe there was something there, like a visitor was over or something. So I don't know. I don't know.
That's a good one.
jeez.
Anyone else?
Follow that.
Mine isn't horrible, but so growing up, I always sort of kept my mind open to supernatural things and stuff like that. So this was actually recently. It was a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. My dog was sick, and she was living with just me at the time. My mom had moved out, and the time came where we made the call. The vet came over, and we had put her down. I was heartbroken. This is my best friend for 10, 12 years. And so I took a nap. After the vet left, I lay down on the couch and I woke up. It was the mid-afternoon, and the first thing I saw when I woke up is my dog's favorite toy just right in the middle of the floor. Don't remember putting it there. And from our windows, there was just a sliver of sunlight, and it was just like on this toy, just like a small 4-inch sliver of sunlight across the floor, and it crossed her favorite little cupcake squeaky toy. And I woke up, and in that moment, I felt, it's really hard when you have a sick pet because you can't talk to them, they can't talk to you, you don't know when the right time is. And I woke up, I saw that, and there was just this sense of like relief, sort of for her and for me. And from that moment, I'd never had an experience before with anything supernatural or things like that. But that was sort of, whether it's my mind playing tricks on me or whatever else it could be, that was sort of, a sort of sublime experience, I think is the only way to describe it.
Wow.
Do you have any, Dan?
Other than that one was, I obviously had an answer to it. I can't think of another one that really stands out to me. There's like real horror, like just bad stuff happening. But we're not going to go there.
That thing with the eyes, though, that was like shared. I feel like that's something that's, exceptional, especially with people. A lot of people's experiences are sort of, individual, but you had friends there with you. And I think that's,
I don't know if you remember. Do you remember?
yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it was the fact that we were like, we had a discussion, like 3 or 4 minutes frozen in place, trying to decide if it was just something inert or not. And the fact that there were embers and they would move, like your brain just goes, and definitely going back to the barn because of that. But that was a good one.
I don't really have any like real scary stories. I've got a funny one with a perfectly scientific explanation. So I own a cafe. It used to be located in this building in a town over that is one of the oldest buildings in like the country. It's like the oldest general store in the entire country. And when we first moved there and we were remodeling, we found the mummified body of a cat under the floorboards. God. And so we always made a joke about there being a ghost cat. But a lot of our employees didn't realize we were joking, but there's this weird thing that'll happen. If you've ever worked in a restaurant, you might know this. If you take a plastic cup and the bottom of it's wet. And you put it on a stainless steel table, it'll just move across the table and fall on the floor. If the temperature is right, it'll just float across the table and fall on the floor. So this happened one day, and we had joked around about the ghost cat, and this girl just screamed.
Such a cat thing to do.
She like started crying. She was like, "It's the ghost cat!"
Whiskers.
Oh, it's great.
Oh shit. Well, this was fun, gentlemen.
Yeah, awesome. I'm so happy you were able to join us, Kevin.
Yeah, Kev.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so very much.
We've mentioned the podcast before, but one more chance, kind of tell people about it, and especially you have a lot of different content, a lot of different kind of stories. Anywhere you'd recommend people jump in, stuff you want to talk about, you have coming up. Just pimp your shit.
Pimp my shit. Okay,
pimp your shit.
Yeah, I'm the host and the game master of the Game Night Heroes podcast. It's a narrative actual play podcast that has, a lot of different stories that we're telling. It's a rotating cast, and we do a bunch of different systems, a bunch of different genres, a bunch of different types of stories. Right now, I've got actually a lot of pots on the stove, which is good. Actually, when I get done here with these cool gents, I'm going to actually be recording a one-shot, maybe an episode or two, arc of a game called Bloodstone, which is kind of like if the video game Bloodborne was a role-playing game. They're like hunters in a weird, creepy, possessed town.
Nice.
My Halloween game this year is Shiver by Parabel Games, which is basically we're playing. It's like a slasher movie as a role playing game. But yeah, we've got lots of cool arts. We've got some D&D fantasy stuff. We play through Green Ronin's Freeport trilogy, which is like pirates in a weird Cthulhu undercurrent type town. We've done some different other kinds of D&D stuff. We've done some Deadlands, which was a lot of fun. We've done it's all kinds of great stuff. Really anywhere. They're nice short. Digestible chunks. The Freeport one's a little long because it was a trilogy, but usually they're between one shots and 6-7 episodes. So yeah, it's a blast though. It's if you like Nasty Graham, hopefully you'll like Game Night Heroes too, because it's the same type of attention to detail and professionalism.
Sweet.
Robot. Yeah. Well, we definitely would like to have you back for another one of these or something else in the future. So, any other guys? Anytime. Any parting thoughts?
This was awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
Horror, I think, is emerging, especially, as a tabletop role-playing game has this revitalization in pop culture. I think horror is a good way to it's parallel and adjacent to like classic fantasy, especially for people who like fantasy role-playing, but maybe want something a little bit different. I think horror is... hopefully they got something from this that helps them start, being able to talk about it with their friends and start a game of their own. I think it's great to see.
I think to your point, Devin, the pop culture event, right? The one that goes hand in hand with horror in D&D.
Stranger Things,
right?
Exactly.
That's it.
Definitely.
Yep.
So
yeah, we're there. So stick around, guys. You'll get to hear more Devin coming up very soon. And thanks for coming by once again, and have a happy Halloween, you spooky fucks.
See you guys.
Awesome, thanks.
A police car and a screaming siren, pneumatic drill, ripped up concrete, a baby wailing, stray dog howling.
That's nasty.